Step inside the walls where history was written in fear and survival. Discover the untold stories of civilians and prisoners trapped during America's darkest days. Every cell holds a secret, every guard a story of power and control. Subscribe now and uncover the true crimes that history almost forgot. The iron door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the cold stone hallway of Fort McHenry. A man stood alone inside a dark casement, the thick walls swallowing his voice as he shouted that he had done nothing wrong. He was not a soldier. He had not fired a weapon. He had not attacked anyone. His crime was something far more dangerous during the Civil War. He was accused of being disloyal. Outside, guards walked past with rifles resting on their shoulders. Inside, the prisoner's hands trembled. He had not been given a normal trial. No jury sat in a courtroom to decide his fate. No neighbors stood to defend him. A military order had sent him here. And he was not alone. Dozens of civilians, editors, lawmakers, businessmen, even ordinary citizens had been locked inside Fort McHenry in Baltimore between 1861 and 1865. Some would stay for weeks, others for months. A few would never fully recover from what happened behind those stone walls. But how did a fort famous for defending America during the War of 1812 become a prison for its own people? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning of the Civil War. In April 1861, the United States was breaking apart. Southern states had already left the Union. President Lincoln faced a nation on the edge of collapse. The first shots of the war had been fired at Fort Sumter. Fear spread quickly across the North. Baltimore, Maryland, sat in a dangerous position. It was a border city in a slave state that had not joined the Confederacy. Many people there supported the South. Others supported the Union. Tension filled the streets like smoke before a fire. Then came April 19, 1861. Union soldiers marched through Baltimore on their way to defend Washington, D.C. A violent mob attacked them. Shots were fired. Soldiers and civilians died. The event became known as the Pratt Street Riot. Washington was suddenly exposed. If Maryland joined the Confederacy, the capital would be surrounded. President Lincoln made a decision that would change American history. He suspended the writ of Habeas Corpus. This legal protection had allowed arrested people to demand to see a judge and challenge their imprisonment. With it suspended, the military could arrest and hold people without immediate trial. Fort McHenry, standing strong at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor, became more than a defensive fort. It became a military prison. At first, the detentions were small. A few suspected Confederate sympathizers were taken. Officials believed they were preventing sabotage or rebellion. The nation was at war, they said. Strong action was needed. But soon, the arrests grew. Newspaper editors who criticized the Union war effort were taken from their offices in the middle of the night. State lawmakers suspected of planning to vote Maryland out of the Union were arrested before they could gather. Ordinary citizens, accused by neighbors of speaking kindly about the Confederacy, found soldiers at their doors. Many were brought to Fort McHenry. The fort's stone casements were never designed for long-term civilian imprisonment. The rooms were damp and dark. Air flowed through narrow openings meant for cannons, not comfort. Prisoners slept on rough floors or simple cots. Food was basic army rations, salted meat, bread, sometimes beans. Some detainees were allowed to write letters, but those letters were inspected. Visits from family were rare and controlled. No one knew how long they would stay. Imagine waking up one morning not knowing if you would see your home again, not knowing if your children understood why you were gone. One of the earliest and most famous detainees was John Merriman, a Maryland citizen accused of helping destroy railroad bridges to slow Union troops. He was arrested and held at Fort McHenry. Merriman demanded to see a judge. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that Lincoln did not have the power to suspend habeas corpus. He ordered Merriman released, but the military ignored the ruling. Merriman stayed imprisoned. This was a shocking moment. A president had defied a Supreme Court justice during wartime. The Constitution itself seemed to hang in the balance. Supporters of Lincoln argued that saving the Union required bold action. Critics said America was losing the freedoms it claimed to defend. Inside Fort McHenry, the debate was not political, it was personal. Prisoners counted days by scratching marks on stone. Some tried to stay hopeful, believing they would soon be freed. Others feared they would be forgotten. Guards enforced strict discipline. While Fort McHenry was not as deadly as Civil War battlefield prisons like Andersonville, it was still a place of confinement and control. Civilians were treated under military authority, not civil law. Outside the fort, Baltimore lived under watch. Federal troops patrolled streets. Newspapers softened their criticism. Lawmakers who might have voted for secession were no longer free to gather. The arrests had worked, at least in one sense. Maryland did not leave the Union. But at what cost? As the war dragged on, detentions continued. The fort housed not only suspected rebels, but also people accused of discouraging enlistment or speaking against federal policy. Some were eventually released after signing loyalty oaths. Others were transferred to different facilities. Yet each arrest sent a message. During national emergency, freedom could be paused. And still, something even more alarming was building. By 1862, rumors spread of new arrests planned across Maryland. Secret lists were said to contain names of judges, journalists, and businessmen. Families began to whisper, who would be next? One night, soldiers arrived at the home of a well-known newspaper editor. They did not knock politely. They did not wait for daylight. They entered with authority. By morning, he was inside Fort McHenry's stone walls. His printing press stood silent. As word spread, fear deepened. People began to censor themselves before the government could. Fort McHenry had become more than a prison. It had become a warning. Yet, while some Americans felt protected, believing arrests stopped sabotage and rebellion, others believed something sacred was slipping away. The Constitution promised rights even in difficult times, but war changes everything. Inside one cold casement, a prisoner pressed his ear against the stone, trying to hear the harbor outside. He wondered if the same flag that once flew proudly above Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 still meant freedom for him, or had the meaning changed? Because as more civilians were brought through those iron doors, one question refused to go away. If the government could jail people without trial during war, what would stop it from doing so again? And as the war intensified in 1862 and 1863, the number of detentions did not slow. Instead, they expanded. In the next chapter, arrests would reach deeper into Maryland's political world, and Fort McHenry would face growing national criticism. But the most shocking moment was
was still ahead, because one decision would test the limits of presidential power like never before. And when that moment came, the entire country would be forced to ask, was this justice or something far more dangerous? The knock came before sunrise. Boots pounded against wooden floors. A door burst open. A state lawmaker was pulled from his bed while his family watched in silence and fear. He was not charged in a courtroom. He was not shown evidence. He was handed a military order. By nightfall, he was behind the thick stone walls of Fort McHenry. This was no longer about one man like John Merriman. Now it was about power, real power, the power to decide who could speak, who could vote, and who would disappear into a
military prison without trial. And this time, the stakes were even higher. In 1861 and 1862, federal officials feared that Maryland's legislature might vote to leave the Union. If that happened, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by Confederate states. The capital of the United States would be trapped. President Abraham Lincoln and his military commanders believed they could not let that happen. So before lawmakers could gather to discuss secession, several of them were arrested. Some were taken quietly, others were seized publicly. They were accused of disloyalty or of supporting the Confederacy. Many were transported straight to Fort McHenry. Imagine being elected by your community, chosen to represent their voice, only to be locked in a stone cell before you could even sit in session. Inside the fort, the atmosphere grew heavier. The casemates were not large, the ceilings curved low. Thick brick and stone trapped damp air inside. In winter, the cold sank into bones. In summer, the heat made breathing difficult. There was no privacy. Conversations echoed. Guards' footsteps never seemed to stop. The food was simple and plain. Army rations served at set times. Salted meat, hard bread, sometimes beans. It was not starvation like in southern prison camps, but it was not comfort either. It was control. Prisoners woke when ordered, slept when told, walked only in designated spaces. Some tried to stay calm. They read books when allowed. They talked quietly about law and politics. Others grew restless, angry, afraid. One detainee later wrote that the worst part was not the food or the cold, it was the silence about their future. No one could tell them when they would be free. Days turned into weeks. Outside the fort, news spread across the country. Newspapers in the North debated the arrests. Some supported them, saying the nation was fighting for survival. Others warned that freedom itself was under attack. Chief Justice Roger Taney had already challenged Lincoln once over habeas corpus, but Lincoln stood firm. He argued that the Constitution allowed him to take emergency measures to save the Union. He famously asked, should all the laws but one go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated? To Lincoln, preserving the Union justified the suspension of certain rights. To his critics, it was a dangerous step towards dictatorship. Inside Fort McHenry, those debates felt far away. What prisoners felt was isolation. Letters home were sometimes delayed or denied. Family members waited outside the gates, hoping for a glimpse. Some wives struggled to support children without their husband's income. Businesses collapsed when their owners were detained. The punishment reached beyond the prison walls. In Baltimore, the message was clear: speak carefully. Editors softened their language. Public meetings became smaller. People whispered instead of shouting. Fort McHenry stood in the harbor like a silent reminder. But then something changed. By 1863, the Civil War had grown even more brutal. Battles like Antietam and Gettysburg left thousands dead. The nation was exhausted. Fear of Confederate spies and saboteurs increased. Federal officials widened their net. Not only politicians, but also civilians accused of discouraging Union enlistment or criticizing the draft were detained. Some were held briefly and released after taking loyalty oaths. Others stayed longer. One case shocked the public.
a newspaper editor who strongly opposed the war was arrested and sent to military confinement. His paper had criticized federal policies and questioned the draft. Authorities claimed his words weakened the war effort. Supporters argued he was exercising free speech. Opponents said his writing gave aid to the enemy. Inside Fort McHenry, he waited like the others. This raised a powerful question. Where is the line between free speech and treason during war? The fort became a symbol. To some, it represented strength and security. To others, it represented fear and lost liberty. Meanwhile, guards at Fort McHenry followed strict orders. They were soldiers, not politicians. They enforced discipline. They ensured no one escaped. They maintained silence at night. There were no large-scale prison riots recorded there during this time, no mass starvation, but the tension was real. Each new arrival carried a story. A businessman accused by a rival of Confederate sympathy. A young man overheard speaking kindly about Southern troops. A local official who refused to swear loyalty to the Union. Some of these accusations were based on real suspicions. Others may have been fueled by personal grudges. And once inside Fort McHenry, clearing your name was not easy. Still, Maryland did not secede. Washington, D.C. remained safe from being surrounded. From a military point of view, the strategy worked, but the war would not last forever. As 1864 approached and Union victory seemed closer, questions grew louder. Would these prisoners be freed? Would the suspension of habeas corpus end? Or had something permanent changed in American government? Then came 1865. The war ended in April with Confederate surrender. Celebrations swept the North. For prisoners at Fort McHenry, hope returned. Surely now they would be released. Many were. Gradually, detainees were discharged. Some walked free quietly. Others returned home bitter and changed. A few attempted legal action afterwards, though most cases faded as the country focused on rebuilding. But even as the cells emptied, the memory remained. Fort McHenry had once symbolized resistance against foreign attack in 1814, when its survival inspired the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now it carried a second identity. It had been a prison for American civilians. And just when the story seemed to be closing peacefully, a final shock struck the nation. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. Fear returned instantly. Once again, suspected conspirators and sympathizers were arrested across the country. Military prisons filled quickly. Americans who thought the emergency powers would fade realized something chilling. In times of crisis, the government could move fast and freedom could move slowly. Fort McHenry's role during the Civil War forced the nation to confront a difficult truth. Security and liberty are not always easy partners. And as the country entered Reconstruction, the debate over civil rights, federal authority, and emergency powers would only grow louder. But one haunting question lingered over Baltimore Harbor long after the last prisoner left the fort. Because sometimes the most powerful prisons aren't the ones made of stone. They are the ones built from fear. The cell was empty. The iron door stood open. The damp stone walls that once held frightened civilians now echoed with silence. Footsteps that once marched with authority had faded. The war was over, but the questions had just begun. When the final detainees walked out of Fort McHenry in 1865, some stepped into sunlight with relief. Others stepped out carrying anger. They had lost months of their lives. Some had lost businesses. Some had lost trust in their government. And America itself had changed. The Civil War ended in April 1865. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. The country celebrated victory. But victory did not erase memory. Fort McHenry had once been a proud symbol of American resistance during the War of 1814, where its survival inspired the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now it carried a second identity.
It had been a prison for American civilians. And just when the story seemed to be closing peacefully, a final shock struck the nation. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. Fear returned instantly. Once again, suspected conspirators and sympathizers were arrested across the country. Military prisons filled quickly. Americans who thought the emergency powers would fade realized something chilling. In times of crisis, the government could move fast, and freedom could move slowly. Fort McHenry's role during the Civil War forced the nation to confront a difficult truth. Security and liberty are not always easy partners. And as the country entered Reconstruction, the debate over civil rights, federal authority, and emergency powers would only grow louder. But one haunting question lingered over Baltimore Harbor long after the last prisoner left the fort. If war could silence citizens once, what might the next crisis bring? In the next chapter, we will examine what happened after the war ended, how history judged these detentions, and why Fort McHenry still stands as a warning today. Because sometimes, the most powerful prisons are not the ones made of stone, they are the ones built from fear. The cell was empty. The iron doors stood open. The damp stone walls that once held frightened civilians now echoed with silence. Footsteps that once marched with authority had faded. The war was over, but the questions had just begun. When the final detainees walked out of Fort McHenry in 1865, some stepped into sunlight with relief. Others stepped out carrying anger. They had lost months of their lives. Some had lost businesses. Some had lost trust in their government. And America itself had changed. The Civil War ended in April 1865. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. The country celebrated victory. But victory did not erase memory. Fort McHenry had once been a proud symbol of American resistance during the War of 1812. It was where the American flag survived British bombardment and inspired the national anthem. For decades, it represented freedom and courage. Now, it carried a second story. Between 1861 and 1865, civilians were detained there without traditional trials. Lawmakers were arrested before voting sessions. Newspaper editors were jailed for criticizing policy. Ordinary citizens were imprisoned because someone accused them of sympathy for the Confederacy. No firing squad stood in the yard. No mass graves marked the grounds. But the silence inside those casemates told a different kind of story. The story of suspended rights. After the war, legal debates continued. Had President Abraham Lincoln gone too far by suspending habeas corpus? Or had he done what was necessary to save the Union? Supporters argued the country was in danger of collapse. Maryland was a border state. If it had joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. could have fallen. Arresting suspected secessionists may have prevented disaster. Critics warned of a dangerous precedent. If one president could jail civilians without trial during war, what would stop another president from doing the same during a future crisis? The Constitution did allow suspension of habeas corpus when, in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. But it did not clearly state who had the power to suspend it, Congress or the president. During the war, Lincoln acted first. Congress later passed legislation supporting certain wartime measures. Still, the debate never fully disappeared. For the former prisoners of Fort McHenry, the issue was not theoretical. Some returned home quietly. They tried to rebuild. They reopened newspapers. They resumed business. They re-entered politics. Others could not recover so easily. Imagine explaining to your child why soldiers took you away. Imagine trying to convince neighbors that you were not a traitor. Some detainees felt their reputations were permanently damaged. Even if they had not been formally charged, suspicion followed them. Fort McHenry's stone walls had not only confined bodies, they had marked lives. As Reconstruction began, the country faced new challenges. The South lay in ruins. Former Confederate states were brought back into the Union. New laws aimed to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans, yet tensions remained high. Ironically, during Reconstruction, federal authorities would again use strong measures in parts of the South to stop violent groups like the early Ku Klux Klan. Arrests were made. Military power was used to enforce order. The same questions returned. How much power should the federal government have during emergency? How far can leaders go to protect the nation? Fort McHenry stood quietly in Baltimore Harbor as these debates continued. The cannons no longer fired. The prison cells were no longer full. But its Civil War history lingered. Over time, the public memory of Fort McHenry focused mostly on its War of 1812 fame. School children learned about the flag that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. Tourists visited to celebrate patriotism. Fewer people spoke about the civilian prisoners of 1861 to 1865. But historians did not forget. They studied the Merriman case. They examined arrest records. They reviewed letters written by detainees from inside those casemates. Those letters often expressed confusion more than hatred. One prisoner wrote about watching ships in the harbor and wondering if freedom was just beyond reach. Another described the strange feeling of being punished without knowing the exact crime. These voices remind us that history is rarely simple. Fort McHenry was not a death camp. It was not a place of mass torture, but it was a place where civil liberties were paused in the name of national survival. And that pause matters. Because once a right is suspended, even temporarily, it changes how people see their government. Lincoln himself understood the weight of his decisions. He believed saving the Union justified emergency action. He did not see himself as destroying liberty, but as protecting it for the future. He never lived to see how history would judge him. After his assassination, the nation focused on mourning and rebuilding. The story of civilian detentions faded into the background, but the legal lessons remained. Future courts would look back at Civil War cases when deciding questions about executive power during wartime. The balance between liberty and security would appear again during World War I, World War II, and other national crises. Each time, echoes of Fort McHenry could be heard. A government facing danger, citizens fearing rebellion, rights tested under pressure. Today, when visitors walk through Fort McHenry, they see stone walls, cannon openings, and open sky above the harbor. They hear about the flag that survived bombardment. But imagine standing in one of those casemates at night. Imagine the year is 1862. You are not a soldier. You are not on a battlefield. Yet you are locked behind thick stone because someone believes your words are dangerous. You do not know when you will be free. You do not know if the courts will help you. All you can hear is the wind from the harbor and the steady footsteps of guards. That's part of Fort McHenry's true story. It is a story of fear and control, of survival and sacrifice, of a nation trying to hold itself together while walking the thin line between safety and freedom. The Civil War tested America in ways no one had imagined. Fort McHenry became one small but powerful stage where that test played out. And here's the final question that still lingers over Baltimore Harbor. If the survival of a nation requires limiting freedom for a time, how long is too long? History does not give easy answers,
but it gives warnings. Fort McHenry stands today not only as a monument to courage against foreign attack, but also as a reminder that liberty must be guarded carefully, even during war. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with cannons. They are fought in courtrooms, in prison cells, and in the quiet hearts of citizens who wonder whether their country still trusts them. This has been Fort McHenry Civilian Detentions 1861 to 1865 True Crime Documentary. If this story made you think, remember this. Freedom is strongest when it is tested, and the lessons of the past are only powerful if we are brave enough to remember them. The list was longer than anyone expected. Names written in ink, politicians, editors, business owners, ordinary citizens, some powerful, some unknown, all labeled the same way, suspected of disloyalty. The war was ending, but fear was not. Even after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered in April 1865, federal officials worried that secret networks of sympathizers still existed. President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The shock of that murder made authorities believe hidden enemies could still strike again. And in moments like that, Fort McHenry's doors did not always stay open. Though most wartime detainees were released after the war, the mindset that allowed their arrest did not vanish overnight. The Civil War had changed how America understood emergency power. The fort itself stood quiet, but its legacy had grown louder. Inside the final months of detentions, prisoners could sense the shift. Some were told they would soon be free. Others waited in silence, unsure whether new accusations would keep them locked away. One former detainee later described the strange feeling of hearing celebrations from Baltimore Harbor while he remained confined inside thick stone walls. Fireworks exploded in the distance. Ships blew horns. The war was over, but his freedom was still uncertain. That moment captured the heart of Fort McHenry's true crime story. Not a crime of violence, not a crime of blood, but a crime of fear. The fear that words could be weapons, the fear that neighbors could be enemies, the fear that democracy itself could collapse. When the final civilian detainees were released, they walked out carrying invisible scars. Some tried to return to politics. Some avoided public life entirely. A few publicly defended Lincoln's actions, saying strong leadership had saved the nation. Others never forgave what had happened. They argued that once the government locked up lawmakers without trial, something sacred had been broken. And here is what makes this story powerful even today. Fort McHenry was not operating in secret. The arrests were reported in newspapers. The suspension of habeas corpus was debated publicly. Court rulings challenged presidential authority. Yet the detentions continued. That tells us something important. During national emergencies, fear can move faster than law. Chief Justice Roger Taney had ruled early in the war that the president did not have sole authority to suspend habeas corpus, but the military ignored that ruling at first. Later, Congress passed legislation giving broader approval to wartime suspensions. The balance between branches of government bent under pressure. Fort McHenry became one of the places where that bending was visible. And while the fort did not witness mass executions or violent prison riots, it witnessed something equally serious: the quiet reshaping of power. Years passed, the nation rebuilt. The fort eventually returned to its identity as a historic symbol of patriotism. Visitors walked its grounds and thought of the American flag surviving bombardment in 1814. Few imagined civilians once stood behind those same walls, unsure if they would ever see freedom again. But historians kept digging. Records showed that dozens of Maryland legislators had been arrested in 1861 to prevent a possible vote for secession. That action likely kept Maryland in the Union. Without Maryland, Washington, D.C. might have been surrounded by Confederate territory. From a military perspective, the strategy worked. From a civil liberty perspective, the cost was heavy. That is the tension at the center of this story. Security versus freedom. Survival versus rights. Even today, legal scholars study the Civil War detentions when discussing presidential authority during emergencies. Court cases in later wars referenced these moments. The echoes of Fort McHenry can be heard whenever the nation debates how far leaders can go during crisis. And here is the truth. The Civil War was one of the most dangerous times in American history. The government faced rebellion from within. States had already left. Armies were fighting. The capital itself was at risk. Leaders made choices under enormous pressure. Some of those choices saved the Union. Some left lasting scars. As the years passed, former detainees told their stories. Some expressed understanding. Others expressed anger. But almost all agreed on one thing. They never forgot the sound of that iron door closing. That sound represented uncertainty. It represented power. It represented a moment when the meaning of freedom felt fragile. Fort McHenry still stands today in Baltimore Harbor. Its walls are solid. Its grounds are peaceful. Tourists walk through its casemates, sometimes unaware of the Civil War prisoners once held there. But if you stand quietly inside one of those stone rooms and close your eyes, you can imagine it. The echo of boots, the scrape of metal against stone, a man wondering why he has been taken from his family, a government believing it is protecting the nation. Both realities existed at the same time. That's why this story matters. Because history is not only about heroes and victories, it is also about hard decisions and their consequences. Fort McHenry's civilian detentions 1861 to 1865 is a true story of wartime power. It's about what happens when fear and survival meet constitutional rights. It forces us to ask a question that never goes away. When a country fights to save itself, how much freedom can it afford to lose? The war ended. The prisoners were released. The Union survived. But the argument never truly ended. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Freedom is not only tested on battlefields. Sometimes it is tested in prison cells. And sometimes the quietest stories carry the loudest warnings. This concludes Fort McHenry's Civilian Detentions 1861 to 1865 true crime documentary. If this story made you think, remember this: history's hardest lessons often hide in the shadows. And the next time you see a historic fort standing tall against the sky, ask yourself, what stories are hidden behind its walls? The war was over. The prison doors had opened, but the argument refused to die. Years after the last civilian walked out of Fort McHenry, lawyers, judges, and historians were still fighting over what had happened inside those stone walls. Not with weapons, not with cannons, but with words. Because the real battle had never been about bricks and iron doors. It had been about power. In quiet courtrooms after the Civil War, former detainees asked hard questions. Could the president really suspend habeas corpus on his own? Could civilians be jailed by the military without a normal trial? Had their constitutional rights been violated? Some men tried to sue. Others demanded public apologies. But the country was tired. Reconstruction was messy. The nation wanted to move forward. Still, the legal shadow of Fort McHenry stretched far beyond Baltimore Harbor. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln believed the Union might collapse if strong action was not taken. Maryland was critical. If it had joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. could have been surrounded by Confederate territory. From a military perspective, the strategy worked. From a civil liberty perspective, the cost was heavy. That is the tension at the center of this story. Security versus freedom. Survival versus rights. Even today, legal scholars study the Civil War detentions when discussing presidential authority during emergencies. Court cases in later wars referenced these moments. The echoes of Fort McHenry can be heard whenever the nation debates how far leaders can go during crisis. And here is the truth. The Civil War was one of the most dangerous times in American history. The government faced rebellion from within. States had already left. Armies were fighting.
The Capitol itself was at risk. Leaders made choices under enormous pressure. Some of those choices saved the Union. Some left lasting scars. As the years passed, former detainees told their stories. Some expressed understanding, others expressed anger. But almost all agreed on one thing. They never forgot the sound of that iron door closing. That sound represented uncertainty. It represented power. It represented a moment when the meaning of freedom felt fragile. Fort McHenry still stands today in Baltimore Harbor. Its walls are solid. Its grounds are peaceful. Tourists walk through its casements, sometimes unaware of the Civil War prisoners once held there. But if you stand quietly inside one of those stone rooms and close your eyes, you can imagine it. The echo of boots, the scrape of metal against stone, a man wondering why he has been taken from his family, a government believing it is protecting the nation. Both realities existed at the same time. That is why this story matters. Because history is not only about heroes and victories, it is also about hard decisions and their consequences. Fort McHenry Civilian Detentions, 1861 to 1865, is a true story of wartime power. It is about what happens when fear and survival meet constitutional rights. It forces us to ask a question that never goes away. When a country fights to save itself, how much freedom can it afford to lose? The Civil War ended. The prisoners were released. The Union survived. But the debate never truly ended. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Freedom is not only tested on battlefields. Sometimes it is tested in prison cells. And sometimes the quietest stories carry the loudest warnings. This concludes Fort McHenry Civilian Detentions, 1861 to 1865 true crime documentary. If you found this story powerful, remember that history's hardest lessons often hide in the shadows. And the next time you see a historic fort standing tall against the sky, ask yourself, what stories are hidden behind its walls? The war was over. The prison doors had opened, but the argument refused to die. Years after the last civilian walked out of Fort McHenry, lawyers, judges, and historians were still fighting over what had happened inside those stone walls. Not with weapons, not with cannons, but with words. Because the real battle had never been about bricks and iron doors. It had been about power. In quiet courtrooms after the Civil War, former detainees asked hard questions. Could the president really suspend habeas corpus on his own? Could civilians be jailed by the military without a normal trial? Had their constitutional rights been violated? Some men tried to sue. Others demanded public apologies. But the country was tired. Reconstruction was messy. The nation wanted to move forward. Still, the legal shadow of Fort McHenry stretched far beyond Baltimore Harbor. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln believed the Union might collapse if strong action was not taken. Maryland was critical. If it had joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. could have been surrounded. So federal authorities arrested lawmakers before they could vote on secession. They detained editors who criticized the government. They confined civilians accused of encouraging rebellion. It worked. Maryland stayed in the Union. But the cost does not erase the success. Inside those stone casements, men had lost time they could never get back. Businesses failed while owners were imprisoned. Children grew without fathers at home. Communities were divided. And perhaps most powerful of all, the idea of freedom had been shaken. As the years passed, the Supreme Court would face other cases related to wartime power. One important Civil War-era case, Ex parte Milligan in 1866, ruled that military tribunals could not try civilians when civilian courts were open and functioning.
that decision did not directly focus on Fort McHenry, but it sent a clear message. Even during war, the Constitution still matters. The ruling suggested limits to military authority over civilians. It became part of a larger legal conversation about how far emergency powers can go. Fort McHenry was part of that story. Though it had not been the only military prison holding civilians, it became one of the most symbolic. It represented how quickly fear can reshape government action. Imagine living in Baltimore in 1862. You hear rumors of arrests. You see soldiers in the streets. You know that speaking too loudly against federal policy could bring attention. You lower your voice. You choose your words carefully. Maybe you stay silent. That kind of silence leaves a mark on a society. Yet many Americans at the time believed these steps were necessary. They feared spies. They feared sabotage. They feared that hidden Confederate supporters could destroy railroads, attack supply lines, or even threaten Washington itself. And they were not imagining danger completely. The Civil War saw real acts of sabotage and violence behind enemy lines. The fear of internal collapse was not fantasy, it was real. That is why this story is complicated. Fort McHenry was not simply a place of cruelty. It was a place born from crisis. The soldiers guarding those cells believed they were defending the nation. The officials signing arrest orders believed they were preventing greater disaster. But the civilians inside those cells experienced something very different. They experienced power without explanation. They experienced confinement without clear end dates. They experienced the frightening feeling of not knowing whether the law still protected them. That emotional truth cannot be ignored. As America moved into the late 1800s and then into the 1900s, the lessons of the Civil War continued to influence leaders. During World War I, the government passed laws limiting speech seen as harmful to the war effort. During World War II, Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps. Each time, leaders pointed back to moments in history when emergency powers had been used. Each time, critics warned about repeating mistakes. Fort McHenry stood quietly through all of that. Its walls weathered storms. Its cannons became silent artifacts. Visitors came to celebrate the American flag and the national anthem. But hidden in its story was another lesson. Freedom is strongest when it survives fear, and fear is strongest during crisis. The civilian detentions at Fort McHenry remind us that even nations founded on liberty can struggle when survival feels threatened. It's easy to judge the past from a safe distance. It's harder to imagine the pressure of 1861. The country was tearing apart. Families were divided. Armies were forming. No one knew who would win. In that storm, leaders made choices. Some were heroic. Some were controversial. Some were both at the same time. As we close this chapter, picture one final scene. A former detainee stands outside Fort McHenry years later. He looks at the same stone walls that once held him. The harbor is calm. The American flag waves high above the old stone walls. He feels pride in his country, but he also remembers the iron door. He remembers waiting for news that never came. He remembers wondering if freedom still applied to him. That memory becomes part of the nation's memory. Fort McHenry Civilian Detentions 1861 to 1865 is not just a story about a prison. It's a story about what happens when a democracy is pushed to its limits. It asks a question that every generation must answer for itself. When danger rises, how much freedom are we willing to risk? History does not shout the answer. It whispers it from stone walls. And those whispers still echo across Baltimore Harbor today.
If you have followed this story from the first slammed door to the final quiet reflection, then you understand something powerful. True crime is not always about blood. Sometimes it's about law. Sometimes it's about fear. And sometimes it's about the thin line between protecting a nation and protecting its people. The story of Fort McHenry is finished, but the debate it started is not. And it may never be. The fort stands silent. Waves move gently across Baltimore Harbor. Tourists walk along the paths. Children look up at the American flag flying high above the old stone walls. Cameras click. Voices laugh. It feels peaceful. But inside those walls, history still whispers. Long ago, during the darkest days of the Civil War, Fort McHenry was not just a proud symbol of the nation. It was a place where American civilians were locked away without normal trials. A place where fear shaped decisions. A place where power moved faster than the courts. And now, with time past and dust settled, we must face the final truth of this story.
The Civil War ended in 1865. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished. The country began the long, painful road of Reconstruction. Many of the men once detained at Fort McHenry went back to their homes. Some rebuilt their lives. Some returned to politics. Some faded quietly into history. But what they experienced did not disappear. Their arrests became part of legal textbooks. Their confinement became part of constitutional debates. Their silence inside those casemates became part of a warning for future generations. Because here is what Fort McHenry truly represents. It represents a moment when the United States feared itself. The government feared that its own citizens might destroy it from within. That fear led to arrests of lawmakers. It led to imprisonment of newspaper editors. It led to the suspension of Habeas Corpus, the legal right to demand a judge review your detention. President Abraham Lincoln believed he was acting to save the nation. Many Americans agreed with him. They saw Maryland as the key to protecting Washington, D.C. They believed quick action stopped possible rebellion. And they were likely right about one thing. Maryland did not leave the Union, but the method used to ensure that loyalty left deep questions behind. Could the president suspend habeas corpus without Congress at first? Chief Justice Roger B. Taney had said no in the Merriman case. The military ignored him. Later, Congress gave broader support for emergency measures. The branches of government strained against each other. The Constitution bent under pressure, but it did not break. That may be the most important lesson of all. After the war, courts slowly reasserted limits on military power over civilians. In cases like Ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court made clear that civilians could not be tried by military courts where civilian courts were open. These rulings helped shape future protections. In a way, the story of Fort McHenry helped strengthen the legal system in the long run. By testing the limits, it forced the country to define them more clearly. Still, none of that erased what happened to the individuals who sat in those cold stone rooms. Think about a father taken from his family at night. Think about a newspaper editor who watched his printing press fall silent. Think about lawmakers stopped from voting by the sound of soldiers at their door. For them, this was not theory, it was life. And life does not come with footnotes or legal arguments. It comes with fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. Today, Fort McHenry is remembered mostly for 1814, when it survived British attack and inspired the national anthem. That story is powerful and important, but the Civil War chapter is just as real. Between 1861 and 1865, the fort became a symbol of emergency authority. It showed how quickly rights can be limited when leaders believe the nation is at risk. And here is the final tension. If Lincoln had done nothing, if Maryland had voted to leave the Union, Washington, D.C. might have been cut off. The war could have ended differently. The United States might not have survived as one country. So, was the suspension of rights the price of survival? Or was it a dangerous step that could have led it to something worse? History gives us clues, but not simple answers. What we do know is this: Fort McHenry teaches that freedom is not automatic. It must be protected not only from foreign enemies, but also during moments of fear inside the nation itself. The iron doors are open now, the casemates are empty, but their story remains. When you walk through Fort McHenry today, you may hear about cannons and flags, but if you listen carefully, you might also hear echoes of boots on stone. You might imagine a man sitting alone, wondering if the Constitution still speaks for him. That image matters, because every generation faces its own crisis. Every generation must decide how much power to give its leaders when danger feels close. And every generation must remember what happened the last time fear and freedom collided. Fort McHenry Civilian Detentions 1861 to 1865 is a true chapter of American history. It is not fiction, it is not rumor, it is documented fact. Civilians were detained, habeas corpus was suspended, political leaders were arrested before they could act. The Union survived, but the questions survived too. As we close this documentary, one thought remains stronger than any cannon that once stood on those walls. A nation can win a war and still struggle with its conscience. Fort McHenry stands today not only as a monument of pride, but also as a quiet reminder. Freedom is strongest when it is defended carefully. Power is safest when it is limited wisely. And history speaks loudest when we are willing to listen. This concludes Fort McHenry Civilian Detentions 1861 to 1865 true crime documentary. The story may be finished, but the lesson is not. On the night of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by actor John Wilkes Booth. The assassination stunned a nation already shattered by 4 years of civil war. Within days, federal authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Booth was killed in Virginia, but several alleged conspirators were arrested and brought back to the Capitol under heavy military guard. The accused were imprisoned at the Old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington, D.C., a military prison along the Anastasia River. Among the accused were Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. The prison conditions were severe. The inmates were kept in small, isolated cells under constant watch. For much of their confinement, they were hooded to prevent communication and guarded day and night by armed soldiers. Their diet was simple and strictly controlled, basic rations of bread, meat, and water, reflecting the military's fear that further plots might unfold. The trial was conducted by a military commission rather than a civilian court, a controversial decision that still sparks debate among historians and legal scholars. The proceedings were swift. In July 1865, 4 of the accused, Surratt, Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt, were sentenced to death and executed by hanging inside the prison grounds. Others received long prison terms at the Dry Tortugas in Florida. The Old Arsenal Penitentiary became a symbol of wartime justice, where the boundaries between national security, punishment, and constitutional rights were tested in the shadow of tragedy. In July 1864, as the Civil War intensified, the Union Army opened the Elmira prison camp in Elmira, New York, to hold captured Confederate soldiers. Originally designed to house around 5,000 prisoners, the camp quickly became overcrowded, at times holding nearly double that number. What followed was one of the most controversial prison stories of the 1860s, earning Elmira the grim nickname Hellmira. Conditions inside the camp were harsh and deteriorated rapidly. Inmates lived in overcrowded barracks with poor ventilation and inadequate sanitation. Clean water was limited, and food rations were often insufficient or nutritionally poor. Prisoners commonly received bread, salt pork, and thin soup, but shortages and spoilage made matters worse. Disease spread quickly through the camp. Smallpox, dysentery, and pneumonia were common. During the brutal winter of 1864 to 1865, freezing temperatures and lack of proper clothing led to widespread suffering. Nearly 3,000 prisoners died, a mortality rate comparable to some of the worst Confederate prison camps in the South. Discipline inside Elmira was strict. Prisoners who attempted escape or broke camp rules faced confinement in a punishment area known as the guardhouse or were placed in stocks. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter fence, and a deadline marked a boundary prisoners could not cross without being shot. While Elmira was established as a wartime necessity, its high death toll later fueled accusations of neglect and retaliation, especially given the horrific conditions Union prisoners faced in southern camps like Andersonville.
The story of Elmira Prison Camp remains a powerful example of how prison systems during wartime can become sites of extreme hardship. It highlights the realities of inmate life in the 1860s, where overcrowding, limited food, disease, and military discipline defined daily existence behind the walls. The whistle of the guards echoed across the frozen grounds of Elmira Prison Camp. It was early morning in late December 1864, and a cold wind swept through the barracks, rattling the wooden shutters and chilling the men inside. Confederate prisoners huddled together for warmth, wrapped in tattered blankets that barely kept out the bitter winter air. Their fingers were stiff from frostbite, their stomachs growled, and yet they dared not complain too loudly, because any misstep could land them in the guardhouse, or worse, on the wrong side of the camp's deadline. Elmira was never meant to be a death camp. When it opened in July 1864, Union authorities had intended it to hold about 5,000 Confederate prisoners captured during battles in Virginia and the Carolinas. But by the fall, more than 7,000 men were crowded inside, packed into barracks designed for far fewer. The result was chaos. Unventilated rooms reeked of sickness and despair. Floors were covered in mud and excrement, and rats scavenged for scraps of food. Each day was a battle for survival, a struggle against hunger, disease, and the psychological toll of confinement. Food was the first and often the most immediate challenge. Rations were meager, thin bread, a small portion of salted pork, and sometimes a watery bean soup. If the rations ran short, men scavenged what they could, trading lice-ridden blankets for stale bread or attempting to sneak scraps from the kitchens. Those who broke the rules were punished swiftly. In Elmira, discipline was strict and unyielding. Soldiers patrolled the rows of barracks, and anyone who tried to escape or caused a disturbance risked being placed in the guardhouse, chained to iron fixtures, or subjected to hard labor. The infamous deadline loomed across the camp. Cross it, even by accident, and the guards were authorized to shoot. The combination of fear and scarcity made the camp a place of constant tension. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, smallpox, and pneumonia claimed thousands of lives. By the end of the war, nearly 3,000 Confederate prisoners had died inside Elmira, earning it a reputation that still haunts history books. The mortality rate rivaled that of notorious Southern prisons, and yet many Northern officials insisted that Elmira's harsh conditions were necessary to maintain order during wartime. For the prisoners, however, each day was a struggle against death, with little comfort or hope. One of the harshest punishments at Elmira was the guardhouse confinement. Men could be locked in small, dark rooms with no bedding, barely enough air to breathe, and only water provided. Some prisoners were kept there for days or weeks, their bodies and minds slowly breaking under the weight of isolation. Others were placed in stocks, forced to sit or kneel in uncomfortable positions for hours as guards paced nearby, ready to enforce discipline with whips or clubs. It was a system designed to instill fear, to keep the camp under control, but it left psychological scars that lasted long after the war ended. Winter was the cruelest season. Barracks were poorly insulated, and the temperatures inside often dropped below freezing. Men huddled together for warmth, but blankets were limited, and many froze through the night. Frostbite and hypothermia were common, and there were reports of men dying in their bunks, too weak to move. For those who survived, the cold compounded the misery of hunger and disease, making Elmira a place where every sunrise was a challenge
and every sunset a victory for merely surviving another day. Yet not all prisoners gave in to despair. Some organized clandestine activities to maintain morale, whispered readings of newspapers, secret letters passed between friends, and small gatherings to discuss news from the front lines. A few daring men even attempted escapes, digging under fences or scaling walls in the dead of night. Most were caught and punished harshly, but their courage provided a glimmer of hope to others. It reminded men that despite the oppressive conditions, human spirit could endure. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The camp surgeons were overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick and wounded. With minimal supplies, they could offer only the most basic treatment: boiled water, bandages, and crude medicines. Disease spread unchecked. Men with dysentery or pneumonia were quarantined, but with so little room and so many prisoners, containment was almost impossible. Infection and death became routine, and the camp slowly filled with makeshift graves for those who did not survive. Families back home received telegrams announcing deaths, often without explanation, leaving them to imagine the suffering endured in Elmira's frozen barracks.
Corruption and tension in the camp added to the misery. Some guards abused their power, taking extra rations for themselves or punishing prisoners arbitrarily. Rivalries among prisoners sometimes erupted into fights over scarce food or sleeping space. Fear, starvation, and disease combined to create a volatile environment. Every decision carried weight. One wrong move could mean a week in the guardhouse or a permanent mark in the records of Elmira's harsh system. Despite these conditions, Elmira remained operational until the end of the Civil War. When the Confederate Army surrendered in April 1865, the remaining prisoners were gradually released or transferred. By mid-1865, the camp closed, leaving behind a legacy of suffering and survival. For the men who endured it, Elmira was not just a prison, it was a place that tested human endurance to its limits, showing both the cruelty of war and the resilience of the human spirit. The Elmira prison story is more than statistics or military reports. It is a tale of real human suffering and resilience. It is about men who faced freezing winters, starvation, disease, and the constant threat of punishment. It is about the choices made by military leaders under pressure, balancing national security against humanitarian concerns. It is about the emotional toll that war leaves not only on battlefields, but behind prison walls, where captivity and fear can become as deadly as bullets. Historians debate the responsibility for Elmira's conditions. Some argue that overcrowding and inadequate supplies were a byproduct of wartime necessity, that the Union had limited resources to care for thousands of captured soldiers. Others contend that neglect and poor planning contributed to unnecessary deaths. Regardless, the stories of the inmates themselves are a chilling testament to the realities of incarceration in the 1860s. By telling this story, we remember more than just statistics. We remember the men who huddled together in freezing barracks, who shared whispered words of hope, who endured disease and hunger. We remember the moments of bravery when prisoners tried to escape or care for one another. And we remember the broader lesson of wartime prisons, that behind the official reports and political decisions are human lives, each struggling to survive in conditions designed to control, punish, and intimidate. Elmira's legacy extends beyond the Civil War. It became a reference point in discussions about prison reform, wartime ethics, and the treatment of captives. Its lessons echo in later conflicts, from World War I to World War II, where questions of prisoner treatment, military authority, and humanitarian responsibility would arise again. The men of Elmira, through suffering and survival, left a powerful imprint on history. And as you imagine walking through the remains of Elmira prison today, the barracks long gone, but the land still bearing memory, picture the men inside. Picture the cold nights, the thin food,
the fear of punishment, the whispers of hope. Picture the resilience it took to endure. Elmira was more than a prison. It was a test of endurance, a lesson in human limits, and a stark reminder of the harsh realities of war. Its story is true, its lessons remain, and its echoes still reach across time, warning us that even in the name of war and necessity, the human spirit and human suffering cannot be forgotten. The prison gates may have opened long ago, but the voices of Elmira, the fear, the courage, and the endurance of its inmates continue to speak to us today. The story of Elmira Prison Camp reminds us that history is not just about victories on the battlefield. It is also about what happens behind the walls, in the shadows, where survival becomes the true measure of strength. And as the cold wind sweeps across the fields where thousands once suffered, one question remains in the silence. How far will a nation go in the name of war before the cost becomes too high? The alarm bells rang through the streets of New York City in July 1863, but this time the danger came not from an enemy army, but from the city's own citizens. The draft riots had erupted, an explosion of violence, fury, and fear that would forever leave its mark on the history of crime, punishment, and prison in the United States. For 4 days, the city descended into chaos as mostly working-class men, enraged over conscription laws, attacked government buildings, wealthy neighborhoods, and African-American communities. Those arrested during the riots were funneled into jails that quickly overwhelmed, creating a tense, brutal environment where inmates faced not only legal punishment, but mob-driven terror before and during incarceration. The prisons were overcrowded almost instantly. Manhattan's Tombs prison, already notorious for poor conditions, now held hundreds of men arrested for rioting, assault, and arson. The cells were cramped, filled with shouting, and often unsanitary. Food rations were limited, small portions of bread and watery soup, and water had to be shared under tense conditions. Guards were stretched thin, and fights between inmates were common. Many prisoners feared for their lives, not just from disease or hunger, but from other men in the cells who sought revenge, protection, or dominance in the chaos. Some prisoners were attacked with fists, broken bottles, or even makeshift weapons smuggled inside, creating a daily atmosphere of terror. Discipline was harsh. Riot participants accused of attacking officials or wealthy homes were sometimes placed in solitary confinement as punishment, though the cells themselves were small, cold, and poorly ventilated. Soldiers and local law enforcement patrolled the prisons constantly, using batons or rifles to enforce order. Some prisoners, particularly those accused of arson or violent assault, faced military-style punishments, including extended confinement and limited visitation. The jails became microcosms of the chaos outside, reflecting the anger, frustration, and fear that had spilled into the streets. Yet, even in these brutal conditions, stories of resilience and quiet defiance emerged. Prisoners shared whatever news they could, comforted one another in whispered conversations, and attempted to keep their sanity amid the overcrowded cells. Some tried to organize themselves to prevent fights, understanding that cooperation could be the difference between survival and death. Families outside tried to send food or letters, but the scale of arrests made this impossible. For many, the wait for trial stretched weeks, with uncertainty adding to the already intense fear of imprisonment. Historians consider the draft riots a turning point in understanding urban unrest and the intersection of civil disobedience, race, and wartime punishment. Those incarcerated during the riots were caught in a system under extreme pressure, where prison became not only a place of legal detention, but also a tool for restoring order and exerting authority in a city teetering on the edge of chaos. The horrors of those days, crowded cells, harsh punishments, and constant fear illustrate how prisons during the 1860s could serve as both punishment and a reflection of societal terror. For many prisoners, Elmira and Fort McHenry were distant legends, but Manhattan's jails during the draft riots represented an immediate living nightmare. The riots forced authorities to rethink prison management during emergencies and highlighted how quickly fear could overwhelm even well-established legal institutions. Overcrowding, limited rations, unsanitary conditions, and strict punishment policies created an environment where survival required both physical and mental endurance.
The New York draft riots serve as a grim reminder that prison crime stories are not always about individual acts, but often about systemic failures in times of crisis. They show how inmates, caught in political and social storms, experienced punishment beyond the legal sentence, facing hunger, violence, disease, and psychological trauma. For historians and criminologists alike, the events of July 1863 highlight how quickly civic unrest can translate into prison suffering, and how war, conscription, and fear can collide to create a perfect storm of inmate misery. By the end of the riots, more than 1,000 arrests had been made, and dozens of prisoners died inside the jails or were executed after court proceedings. Manhattan's jails, like Fort McHenry or Elmira, had become testing grounds for the limits of justice, order, and human endurance. They reflected the harsh reality that during moments of national crisis, prisons became theaters of fear and punishment, where the line between law and terror blurred. In the aftermath, the city slowly regained control, but the legacy of the draft riots persisted. The incarcerated men carried scars, both physical and psychological, from days of imprisonment in brutal conditions. Families mourned lost sons and brothers. Communities grappled with the consequences of violence and fear, and the memory of prison hardship became intertwined with the story of the riots themselves. And here lies the powerful truth. Prison is never just about confinement. It is about control, survival, and the human response to fear. The draft riots of 1863 and the subsequent imprisonment of thousands revealed that during moments of crisis, incarceration could become a tool of terror, a reflection of societal chaos, and a battlefield of its own. For those locked in the cells of Manhattan's jails, the experience was more than punishment. It was a lesson in endurance, a test of humanity, and a chilling reminder of how quickly civil unrest could transform ordinary prisons into chambers of fear and survival. The story of the draft riots is not a distant tale. It echoes today in discussions about civil unrest, prison management, and how governments balance order and rights during crisis. And for the men who endured it, the memory of those crowded cells, harsh rations, and constant fear never faded. If you follow the echoes of history, you can still hear the cries from the draft riots' jails, the sound of human suffering under extraordinary pressure, the clash of justice and fear, and the resilience of those who survived. The full truth of imprisonment during crisis, from Elmira to Fort McHenry to Manhattan, reminds us that history's darkest chapters are often written not on battlefields, but behind prison walls, where fear, punishment, and human endurance meet. The story continues in the next chapter, where we explore one of the lesser-known yet horrifying prison cases of the 1860s, the conditions and crimes at Point Lookout Prison Camp in Maryland, where thousands of Confederate prisoners suffered under extreme heat, disease, and punitive discipline. The sun beat down mercilessly on the fields of Point Lookout, Maryland in the summer of 1864. The air shimmered with heat, carrying the stench of unwashed bodies and stagnant water from the nearby Potomac River. Thousands of Confederate prisoners, captured in battles across Virginia and the Carolinas, were crammed into a space meant for far fewer. Point Lookout had become a sprawling Union prison camp, one of the largest in the country, and inside its wire fences, life teetered on the edge of survival. The barracks were overcrowded wooden shacks with dirt floors, barely enough to shelter the prisoners from sun and rain. Food was scarce. Hardtack, thin soup, and occasional salted pork barely sustained the men. Water drawn from shallow wells often carried disease. Dysentery, smallpox, and malaria spread like wildfire, killing hundreds each month. Inmates fought to stay alive, huddling together for comfort
and trying to shield themselves both from the elements and the ever-present threat of punishment. Guards patrolled relentlessly, enforcing rules with whips, rifles, or threats of confinement in the stockade. Discipline at Point Lookout was strict and at times brutal. Men who stepped out of line were placed in solitary cells, denied food, or forced into grueling labor under the blazing sun. Soldiers enforced a deadline across the camp, warning that any prisoner who crossed it would be shot without hesitation. Escape attempts were met with immediate capture and severe punishment, serving as a warning to others. Disease, hunger, and fear combined to create a relentless cycle of suffering, leaving many prisoners physically weakened and mentally broken. Yet, even in this oppressive environment, moments of quiet resilience emerged. Prisoners shared scraps of information, supported one another in secret, and clung to the hope that the war would end and release would come. Letters smuggled out to families spoke of hardship, but also of determination, capturing the complex humanity of men caught in one of the harshest prison camps of the Civil War era.
Point Lookout remains a stark reminder of how war can transform prisons into places of extreme suffering. Its history is not about heroism or victory, but about endurance, survival, and the human cost of conflict. For those who endured it, the memories of heat, hunger, disease, and punishment would never fade. The walls of Fort McHenry still whisper the truth of fear and endurance. History's darkest moments are closer than you think. Don't miss the next chilling story from America's past. Hit subscribe and join us as we reveal the secrets hidden behind prison doors.